just don't have anything. On the speakerphone. I think Kansas City. Well, Kansas City is different. Kansas City can but I think after a certain.
All right, Zoomies, can you hear me now? Awesome. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Sorry about the delay there. All right, so what is on Thursday? Exam. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Don't forget we have an exam. A student from one of my other classes had the exam slip their mind, and I'm holding to, not giving exceptions. So I know we won't be in person, but don't forget to actually take said exam. All right. So, any questions about the exam at this point? None? Pretty straightforward?
It's going to be over everything we covered in the slide.
Correct. From day one to the end of today.
Okay. And you know, like, if there, how many number of questions are going to be, or is that just going to be determined?
So if that is a question geared towards, will you have enough time, or will there be a time crunch? Don't worry about it. You will have plenty of time.
All right.
Question from Jared. Will we need to look at Demi's lecture for the exam? You don't need to study it in depth. There may be one or two takeaways from that, but you don't need to study it in depth. Other questions? Cool. All right, so what did we learn last time? It's a big old hint up there. What's that? We did learn about cognition. What did we learn about cognition?
The environment plays a big part of how we, I guess, conceive cognition.
Okay, yeah, so give me an example.
Like the example you use where you want to press the room. It's super messy. Like to him, it's still pretty messy, but there's still some type of order what everyone else sees as chaotic.
Yeah, and so we used some specific terms with that. Can you remember what those terms were? Bandwidth. Okay, and what's bandwidth?
It's basically how quickly, when and how often the environment changes.
Exactly. So how often the environment changes. Somebody else give me another one of the words we used. Familiarity. Okay, and what does that refer to in this context? Yeah, or having just a whole bunch of exposure to that environment. Yeah. And there was one other term we used. Knowledge, yes. Okay. And what is that referring to? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's more that knowing where things are. Exactly. Yep. On chat, Dennis says, we have a finite amount of attention and focus. Yes, that is a big takeaway from last exam. Attention is a finite resource. You cannot devote full attention to a whole bunch of things. That's why we're so bad at multitasking. People can't actually multitask. You can task switch. You can multitask with things like chewing gum and walking, but those are things that have become automatic that don't require actually really any attentional resource. But yes, attention is a very finite resource, so use it sparingly. And we talked about the multiple resource theory in regards to attention. Who remembers what the multiple resource theory says? What's kind of the basic takeaway from the multiple resource theory?
I think that's when you only have like so much or so many or a limited set of resources available mentally.
Yes, and in addition, it speaks specifically to the different sensory modalities. So where possible, offload one of the sensory modalities. If you're presenting all the information just visually, that's going to present a real big issue because you have, in addition to a finite attentional resources, you have a finite amount of resources that your visual system can devote to said task. So wherein you can take some visual information and present it auditorily or perhaps haptically, you're in a much better position. All right, any questions about what we covered last time? Cool. All right. Here's your fun fact of the day. When a man allegedly found a dead mouse in his can of Mountain Dew, Pepsi had an expert claim in an affidavit that the drink was so acidic, it would have dissolved the mouse after 30 days, and thus he could not have found a mouse in his can. And yet I still drink Mountain Dew like it's going out of style. I think my teeth are going to turn into liquid and disappear one day. All right. So everything we talked about last time was focusing more on what could kind of be contextualized as microcognition. Now, we're going to focus more on the macrocognition. So what are the high-level mental processes that build on the stages from information processing? And that includes things like situation awareness, which is SA. You'll see me use SA a lot throughout the rest of the semester, so just know that SA means situational awareness. Decision-making, problem-solving, and metacognition. So we're going to spend a good amount of time today talking about decision-making, right? And specifically research that came from two researchers in this field, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. We'll talk about kind of optimal problem solving, and then whether or not humans are optimal problem solvers, and then that metacognition. And so what is metacognition? Yeah, thinking about thinking. What do you know about what you know? Right? Good learners have really good metacognitive abilities. I can identify what are the things I know that I don't know. Right? So you all are probably too young, but Dennis and I probably remember, sorry to call you out here, Dennis, that back in the early 2000s, Donald Rumsfeld, who at the time was the Secretary of Defense, had this whole famous interview wherein he said, there are known knowns, things we know. There are known unknowns, things we know that we don't know. There are unknown knowns, things we don't know that we know. And there are unknown unknowns, things that we don't know, right? And that perfectly kind of summarizes the kind of principle of metacognition, right? So thinking about that thinking. And so within cognitive psychology, or within thinking about cognition, we can kind of break up individuals into experts and novices. And so novices fall into, let's see if I can get this. Come on now. Not gonna work. One last time. There we go. All right. So novices fall into this left category, right? The less proficient people at a certain task. And we'll go over what each of these things mean, but this is just kind of preview what we're going to talk about here. Their reasoning is much more knowledge-based, going through a set of rules that you may have learned. It's a very analytic process, right? So you're having to think through things deliberately. It engages what Kahneman and others call system 2 thinking. So system 2 is going to be this very deliberate type of processing. And within cognitive psychology, there tends to be two different camps, right? One camp is this Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman of heuristics and biases, for which Daniel Kahneman won a Nobel Prize. And then you have this kind of naturalistic decision-making that we'll talk about a little bit more. And the novices tend to be less adaptive when it comes to decision-making, right? So think about this when you started learning how to drive a car. When you're a novice learning how to drive a car, much of your understanding about what to do was very knowledge-based, right? Think about if you learned how to drive a standard car or a manual car, it was very knowledge-based about how to shift. And then after a while, you got to the point where it's just automatic. You didn't even have to think about shifting, you just shifted, right? And then we talk about experts, and experts fall into this more proficient category, and it's very skill-based, right? So learning how to shift, you eventually get to the point where you can just shift without making the car buck, without stalling, etc. It tends to rely on intuition, right? And so if you ask an expert why they did something, they may not be able to verbalize or vocalize why they did something. It was just intuition, and this intuition is learned over time, right? So they're able to rely on this, what's known as system 1 type of thinking. That's very quick, very reactive. And this is that naturalistic decision-making process, right? And so one of the domains in which this naturalistic decision-making comes in is with like firefighters. And so if you ask an expert firefighter how they knew to withdraw from the building before it collapsed, they may not be able to tell you what they're picking up on, but they've seen enough building collapses that they kind of have developed this intuition of when it's time to get out of Dodge. And it tends to be very kind of adaptive in nature. And so again, we have this kind of rough categorization of system 1 versus system 2 thinking. And don't think of these as different levels. Think of these as different categories. You could have orange thinking and pineapple thinking, right? There's just different categories. So system 1 tends to be very fast. It's unconscious, tends to be more automatic. And we tend to use it for a lot of our everyday decisions. Right? So you go to the grocery store and you're walking down the aisle and you have, what, 100 different types of cereal. You don't really sit there and weigh critically each cereal against each other. It's just kind of a quick automatic decision there. However, the problem with system 1 thinking, as I'll show you in a little bit here, is it's very error prone. Right? And this is one of the reasons Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize, because all the ways in which he established these things are error prone kind of revolutionized the field of economics. So in contrast, system 2 is very slow. It's conscious and it's effortful, right? It's not just a gut reaction. It's sitting down and thinking things through. It's relied more on for complex decisions. And it also tends to be more reliable. And so going back to what I showed 2 slides ago with this kind of reasoning level of skill-based versus knowledge-based, let's take a look at this graph here, right? And so you can think about, as you start to learn how to do something, you're taking that sensory input, right? And if you're a novice at whatever that task is, you're going to frequently rely on using those symbols for kind of the identification of the environment. You're then going to have your stated goals that you're going to access, say, okay, what is my goal here to perform? You then make the decision of, okay, what task am I going to do? That decision of the task results in planning of how to execute that task. Then compare it against kind of the stored rules for the task. So am I doing this appropriately? Am I doing this with standard operating procedures, etc.? And then you get to the point where you actually carry out that task. However, with repeated exposure, as you start to gain a little bit more of the skills, you now no longer have to do kind of this early identification, comparing against different sources of knowledge you have. It tends to be more of a recognition, right? Okay, I'm recognizing something's going on here. I've seen this before. You make the association between what is the current state of events and what is the task I want to perform. And then it's a quick comparison for those stored rules for that task, then leading to carrying out that the task. But once you become an expert in a system, you essentially forego anything up here. Right? So one of the things you'll notice with a lot of experts is it's something happens, they react. Something happens, they react. It's not slow. I'm not going through the process of saying, okay, you know, there seems to be fire that spread to the roof of this building. All right, well now let me see, okay, it has reached the joists, the ceiling joists. My goal is to not die in this context, but I also need to search these other rooms. So let me compare against that, decide what that task is, plan that task, and carry it out. It tends to be much more of a, when you're an expert, of a intuition, let's get out of here, right? And so we had kind of 4 different stages of the decision-making process. All right, we can think about the acquiring, the acquisition and integration of information, that interpretation and assessment, that planning and choosing aspect. So once I know what needs to be done, let me plan on how to carry this out or choose the right course of action. And then you're monitoring and correcting. I don't know if this is true, but there's kind of an old Russian military saying that the perfect is the enemy of the good enough, right? It's the idea that act and just adapt, or act and react to what's going on. And that gets into that monitoring and correction of actions. And so you can see how each one of these may take attentional resources, right? If you're focusing on the interpretation and assessment of a situation, you're not really going to be able to devote to whatever that action, the choice of action will be. Right? You see this all the time in like war movies, right? The commander who becomes so overwhelmed trying to assess what's going on that they can't make the right decision, or they can't make any decision in that moment because they're so overwhelmed by the actual interpretation and assessment of that task. But as you become more expert in a domain, it requires less attentional resources at each one of these stages of decision making. Right? So you're more quickly able to just make the choice and go with it. And so decision making can be thought of essentially as either normative or descriptive. So when we say normative, we're talking about what decision would somebody make in an ideal situation, in an idealized situation. Right? What is the optimal decision? And this whole idea of normative decision-making relies on the assumption of a rational actor. Right, this is going to preview some of the discussion about kind of how this, the descriptive decision-making field kind of changed economics. But classical economics treats every individual as a rational decision-maker. Right? Classical economics says that if I know what the magnitude of any given option is, and if I know what the utility of that option is, or that attribute is, I can tell you what decision they're going to make. Right? So this would just suggest that the overall utility of that decision is a function of the sum of each of those attributes times the utility of those attributes.
Could you repeat that last part?
Yeah. So what normative decision-making would say is that your utility, how good a choice is a function of all of the options or all of the attributes of one choice multiplied by the utility of that choice. How good that choice is. Bless you. And so we've already talked about quality decision matrix, or matrices, this semester. And this is just a regurgitation of that and a representation of that kind of normative decision making, right? If you are a normative decision maker, you're going to quantify everything and establish what is the right choice, right? So if you are weighing the different choices of what vehicle to get, and let's say you've identified 5 things that matter to you, you know, the sound system quality, miles per gallon, leather seating, color, maintenance cost. You then assign each of those a relative utility such that maintenance cost is the most important thing to you. Miles per gallon, so fuel economy, is second most important. And now you say we've got 4 different types of cars. And let's establish some sort of rating system such that we can attempt to come at what is the optimal decision. You're not relying on gut instinct. You're not relying on any sort of, you know, soft factors. How can I try to establish what is going to be the best choice? And based off of this data, we would say that the 2010 Lexus would be the best choice. But there are a lot of issues with this kind of approach. One is that it assumes all outcomes are certain. Right? In the case of the car, that makes sense. Right? Because you know that each of these are fairly certain. We'll just treat them as certain. But very little about our decision-making process should be treated as dealing with certainty, right? A lot of the decisions you have to make in life are probabilistic. So what about when outcomes aren't certain? So one example your book talks about is winning $50 with a probability of 1, right? So 100% chance you get $50, or taking a gamble to win $200 with a probability of 0.3. And so if we were a normative decision-making creature, what we would do is calculate the expected value of every choice simply by multiplying the probability times the value. So if any of y'all have taken a philosophy class, this is very similar to like Pascal's wager, right? So what is the utility? What is the value? And in his case, he's talking about religious belief. So what is the value of believing in a certain deity versus the probability, right? And here it's just mapped. So to find the expected value of any individual choice, the expected value of the $50 with a perfect probability would just be $50. The expected value of winning $200 with a probability of 0.3, what would that come out to? 66 and some odd dollars, something like that. And so you can see if we were rational decision makers, we would all choose the second option, right? The 1/3 chance of winning $200 because of that expected value. Oops, I jumped the gun. I was going to have y'all do this. But you know the answer exactly. And if you don't, we're in trouble. Yeah. So again, what this is saying is simply that if you know the value, and it really helps once you've got some sort of monetary value on it, and you know the probability, you can say, okay, what is the best choice to make? So while there's a 0.7 probability that you don't get anything with a $200 gamble, if you take those bets often enough, the payout over time will be greater. However, again, the problem is that this expects people to be rational actors. And for the longest time, this was the foundational assumption of economics, right? That we could map the expected utility, the expected value for every decision and tell you exactly what decision you should make. However, humans are far from rational actors. There are a myriad of ways we're about to go over in which we can be manipulated, our opinions about things can be distorted, all from simple biases and heuristics or mental shortcuts that we have. All right, so from that previous example, show of hands in here and on the chat for Zoom, how many of you would have chosen the 30% chance of winning $200? Okay. And the other ones of y'all would have taken the sure thing at $50? I'm not seeing anybody on Zoom, but I'm going to assume you're reflecting what's going on in class here. Yeah. So most people tend to say, I'll just take the sure thing. I'll take the $50. People don't always try to maximize value, right? And it's not always the case that they should try to maximize value, right? I mean, if you think about yourself as a college student right now, perhaps the guarantee of $50 is going to make a much bigger deal to you than the possibility of $200. Yes, you would be ecstatic if you won those $200, but maybe you could use those $50 to help pay the rent or things right now. And so it's not necessarily the case that you're always going to want to try and maximize that value. People also do what we call satisficing. Satisficing is when you say a decision is good enough. And so like I already previewed, we're frequently using mental shortcuts and biases in our decision making, right? To make it quicker, to make it easier. The brain is an amazingly expensive organ. A massive chunk and a disproportionate chunk by volume and weight of your caloric consumption every day is used by your brain. Right? And so if we're thinking about evolutionarily, it makes sense to establish some shortcuts that can cut down on the caloric consumption required by your brain to make all these complex decisions, because calories haven't always been as readily available as they are now, right? And so if you have a hungry computer in your head, you want to reduce that cost of running that computer where possible. And so wherein attention can only be directed to a limited number of cues, we need to think about what are the things that should be integrated in actual displays. These, 1 second here. All right, I think I got these slightly out of order, but so you want to make sure that when you are establishing some sort of display, you're integrating cues such that you're not requiring additional attention allocation to different aspects. And when we go over displays later in the semester, we'll show some concrete examples of that. We tend to anchor our expectations on values and first information presented to us as a bias. And so even when I present a number that has nothing to do with a subsequent task, that can distort your estimations, right? So one classic example is I would ask half of a group, how much does an elephant weigh? I'd ask the other group, how much does a mouse weigh? And then I would ask both those groups, how many countries are in the UN? Right? The weight of the mouse and the weight of the elephant have nothing to do with how many countries are in the UN. But those who had an anchor on that weight of the elephant estimated to be higher the number of countries in the UN than did those who anchored on the mouse's weight. We also tend to anchor on what's presented to us first. Right? This is one of the reasons why people maintain the same political beliefs their parents had, because the first exposure is to that initial cue. I'm anchoring the expectations of my political beliefs on those of my parents, and it's harder to overcome them later in life. Cue salience. So more salient cues are given more weight, right? That makes no sense from just a logical perspective. But if I have, different values, different dollar amounts for a certain product, and one is presented very saliently to you, and the other is kind of grayed out and off to the side, you tend to think that the one who's more salient is representative of a more accurate estimate, and there is where you anchor your expectations. We also tend to overweight unreliable cues. So one of our proclivities is to treat every possible outcome as if they're equally valid and equally reliable. Hannah asks, is Q primacy why commercials will present the payment price first instead of the full cost? So when you say payment price, I'm not sure what we're talking about, but you're absolutely right that the primacy is why, like, car dealerships will present the MSRP, right? Because saying, hey, here's what the car's worth, rather than you saying, okay, let me compare it to other vehicles and see what the expected utility is for it. You are establishing, okay, here is the initial value I'm going to anchor your expectations on. And so if you ever go into a negotiation, your best bet is always to set the price a little extra high, even if you know you're not going to get that, because when you negotiate down from that, it makes people seem like they're getting a better deal. It makes them feel like they're getting a better deal if they come down to a value based off of that anchoring.
I think she's talking about like when you're like, oh, it's like $120 a month, and they wait till the end to tell you how much the car is actually worth. Like they make it seem more affordable to you.
Ah, okay. So Avery says like 2 payments of $19.99 is what she's referring to. Yeah, so that could be. It makes that feel like you're getting a deal. Exactly. But then also, one of the things you'll notice with a lot of big box stores is everything always seems to be on sale, right? And if it's always on sale, it's never on sale, right? But it's the anchoring on, here's what this is really worth. It's really worth 20 bucks, but we're going to give it to you for 15. But it's never worth 20 bucks. It's always 15 bucks, right? It's direct manipulation of your decision making.
Yeah, even with the numbers, that's why everything is 99. And working in retail for as long as I did, it's our brain, because we read left to right, $19.99 is cheaper than 20, even though it's only a penny different, because we see the 9, we see the 1 and the 9 first, and our brains can't figure out that it's only a cent off.
Yes, and we'll talk about framing in just a second, but yeah, you can start to see all sorts of real world examples wherein you get this sort of manipulation. It's also why when you go to the grocery store, they'll say, 3 for $5. They're anchoring your expectation that you need to buy 3, right? And it typically drives people to buy more. Yeah, and so again, that overweighting of unreliable cues, people tend not to do well with next to nil probability, right? So if you've ever seen Dumb and Dumber, when he asks his crush, what are the chances of you and I getting together? She says something like 1 in a million. He says, so what you're telling me is it's a chance, right? People always hear that, okay, well, it's actually a good chance, right? It's everything is weighted equally, even if it's not supposed to be. We also have these types of heuristics that are entirely manipulatable. And now as we go into election season, you will see this from both sides. I mean, we start getting into direct manipulation of people this time of year. But the first one is the availability heuristic. So the availability heuristic would be what's at play when I say, what's more likely, being killed by a shark or a vending machine? Most people are going to say shark, right? Because the news covers shark attacks. The news doesn't cover vending machine attacks, so to speak. Yeah. But you're actually substantially more likely to be killed by a vending machine. Or a cow, yes. Or a hippo. Or bees. Yes, or peanuts, or yeah. But because it's available in your mind, you say, oh, this must be more likely. Right, so you can see this. I'm going to be an equal opportunity offender here of the political sides. But you'll see this when the right talks about, terrorist attacks. And they'll bring up all these cases of terrorist attacks to make it available and say, this is very likely, and you need to elect us to protect you from it. And the left does the same thing with gun violence, right? They'll say, look at all these cases of gun violence. You need to elect us to protect you from it, right? They're making things available to make it seem like there are very high probability event, when in reality, you are substantially more likely to die in your car on the way home tonight than you are from either of those events. Yeah. Don't worry, that's a really small probability too. Exactly, yes. Yeah. We are the anti-car crash party. Yeah, exactly. We also have the representative heuristic. Representative heuristic is we have kind of this stereotype in our mind of different things, different people, etc. And so if I told you that Jane is quiet, she's a bookworm, and socially reserved, and then I asked you, is it more likely that Jane's a librarian or a bank teller? Most people's initial gut reaction is that she's a librarian, right? We're comparing our stereotype of what a librarian is against the description of Jane, when in reality, it is substantially more likely, just as a base rate, a function of base rates, that she's a bank teller, right? So again, we think we've got this idea. We think that the information about her being a bookworm and quiet and socially reserved is relevant to the decision, but it often is not when we're at least comparing against base rates. Overconfidence, so people tend to believe they're correct more often than they actually are. 75% of people think they're better than average drivers. That can't happen, right? It's a statistical impossibility. And so we often always think that everybody else is the idiot and that it's never us. In my case, that's true, but just kidding. And then we have a phenomenon known as cognitive tunneling. So we tend to get stuck on our initial hypothesis. Right? And you'll see this all the time, especially again in politics. I'm just ragging on politics today. But we get stuck on our initial hypothesis, right? We believe something, and it really doesn't matter how much outside evidence gets thrown at us. We tend to just continue to hang on to that initial hypothesis. It's just a lot easier to stay fixated on our initial belief than it is to evaluate the evidence, to deal with the discomfort associated with saying, holy shit, maybe I've been wrong this whole time, right? So we tend to just hang on to what's going on. We tend to also be simplicity seeking and choice averse. So more alternatives actually make a decision harder and less satisfying. Right? You can apply this to the whole dating world, right? The phenomena of dating apps at this point has put us in a position wherein there are so many alternatives, we feel like maybe we didn't make the right choice. And to clarify, I'm not advocating for arranged marriages here, but one of the things you notice is that people in arranged marriages 5 years down the road tend to be happier because there's not this sort of choice aversion or the complexity associated with, did I make the right decision? Or you can think about kind of the buyer's remorse when you go to get a car, things like that.
So it's kind of like you get a Christmas gift
Mm-hmm.
versus getting money to go. Like, you get the Christmas gift itself. I guess like you said, you can be happy with it.
Yeah.
You're giving the money to go buy the Christmas gift. You can think down the line, I probably should have spent that money on something else.
Yeah, exactly. Or, think about it concretely. If I want a new Washington football team jersey now, it'd probably be much better off for my parents to just get that for me as a Christmas present than to give me the money to go choose which one I want. Yeah, you're exactly right. So think about that next time you give somebody a gift card. You're giving them unhappiness. We also have a confirmation bias. So we tend to seek out information which confirms our pre-existing beliefs. And we're all guilty of this. I do this all the time. Back when I was on Facebook and I'd get into an argument with somebody and I'd go Google to find information, I'd catch myself asking the question in Google in such a way that was only going to return information that confirmed my belief. If you ever find yourself typing into Google the truth about, chances are you're just trying to reconfirm your own belief.
Finding your like blood pressure's up and everything.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Have you ever heard of that YouTube series, Google It Person?
Mm-mm.
Well, it's funny. It's like millennial college humor things or whatever. And thing is, someone looked up like does vaccinations cause autism?
Uh-huh.
And it's like we have like 100,000 things to tell you why it doesn't. Well, you have this one that tells you why it is. It's like, I knew it. It's like, just because I have it doesn't mean it's true.
Exactly. Well, and that gets back to the issue of, where are we now? Yeah, that overweighting of unreliable cues, right? We see one study that says one thing, we see 100 studies that say the opposite, and we tend to say, well, the evidence mixed. Well, yeah, kind of, but not really, right? Yes, you're exactly right. Already talked about those. Yeah, so the confirmation bias, seeking out information which only confirms one's belief. The planning bias is wherein we tend to underestimate the amount of time, money, and effort required to perform a task. I don't remember the exact statistic, but it's something like 90% of government projects come in over time, over budget, or both.
Especially in hospital.
I didn't believe it. Yeah, so back when I was in Colorado, I had this number off the top of my head better, but the Denver airport was supposed to take something like, 3 years and $1 billion. And I think it wound up taking like $7 billion and like 8 years or something like that, right? Not necessarily because of any issues associated with the initial, the bidding process or anything like that. It's just, you tend not to think about all the things that can trip you up. Yes, exactly. Dennis said something that may be more attributable to the rest of us. You always have to make that extra trip to Home Depot, sometimes 2 or 3 additional trips, right? It's that planning of, come on, this is a simple construction project. It'll take me in the morning. And 3 weeks later, you're still working on it, right? We also tend to retrieve just a small number of actions. Right? So we tend to retrieve just a few possible actions, which can obviously be biased by things like anchoring, right? Or that salience. If I try to cue you towards an action you've performed in the past, I can make it more likely that you're going to perform that same action again in the future. Similarly, that availability of actions, so you retrieve what's that most available, quote unquote, action, rather than the right one. So recency, salience. One of my favorite things about this lecture is people frequently go home and start seeing all the ways they're being manipulated on a daily basis, right? Whether it's, by companies, or political campaigns, or friends, even if the friends aren't willingly doing this, they've kind of learned over time that these are very persuasive techniques of doing things.
Have you watched The Social Dilemma?
Yes.
Netflix? That's what all of this is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if y'all haven't seen The Social Dilemma, it's a little hokey at points, I think. But it does do a good job of demonstrating just how much these companies are manipulating you.
And they do a lot of money to do just that.
Oh, yeah.
They know what they're doing.
Yeah, one of the most unsettling things I've heard is that the greatest minds of our generation are putting all their effort into making us stay on websites just a couple seconds longer, right? The availability of possible outcomes. So we have an availability of likelihood of outcomes caused by your decision, right? So you know if one action resulted in a certain outcome, it may make sense for me to go ahead and try that action again. So I bought a lottery ticket, I won 400 bucks. Well, that's pretty salient. I should buy another lottery ticket. That expected value, though, of the lottery ticket is such that for every dollar you put in, you get like 60 cents back, right? So just banking on you continuing to play in that case. And one of the most pernicious ones is the hindsight bias. The whole idea that we knew it all along, or hindsight's 2020. You see this all the time. One of my favorite examples is you'll still sometimes see headlines that say something like, you know, expert who predicted the 2008 crash predicts another crash this next year. It's like, okay, the field collectively did not expect a crash. You're always going to find somebody who says, oh, yes, we knew that. Or let's look back at all these predictors and try to retrofit some explanation for that crash and now say, well, there's got to be another crash coming up. When in reality, nobody really knew, if you look to all the experts, all the financial experts, that the crash in 2008 was coming, right? There are certain indicators they now realize they should have paid attention to. But the whole I knew it all along or hindsight's 2020 is really pernicious in decision making. And you'll see this all the time, especially when it comes to like blaming, right? Anytime there's a big incident or something bad happens, they say, you should have known that this was going to happen. When you can't really guarantee that anybody else with that same information would have done anything different. We can also be biased purely by the framing of the question. So if I were to ask you, how much money would you pay for meat that was 90% lean? Your answer would be higher than if I said, how much money would you willingly pay for meat that was 10% fat? It's the exact same meat. But me framing it as 90% lean, look how lean this is, you're going to pay more money. And so, Dennis, that gets to your earlier example of if I say something's $19.99, the framing is it's not even 20 bucks. Awesome. Or that absurd 1/10 of a cent at gas stations. Right? So they're milking you for that whole extra penny. You're just not aware that they are. We also have a default heuristic. Excuse me. So when faced with uncertainty, we tend to just go with the default answer. This is why there are such incredibly discrepant results for opt-in versus opt-out organ donation. If you do it how we do it in the US, at least most states, there may be states that are exceptions, but as an opt-in program, I say, do you want to be an organ donor? And you have to check yes. To be an organ donor, I'm going to get like low double digits for organ donation. If, on the other hand, you do it like they do in, I think, some like Nordic or Scandinavian countries and say it's an opt-out, you don't have to be an organ donor. But when you go to their equivalent of the DMV and they say, do you want to be, or do you want to opt out of organ donation? And you have to check a box. People just don't check the box, right? And so there, they get organ donation rates at about like 80%, right? It's a massive discrepancy. And there are actually movements now to try and change the way we do it here in the US, because that would help solve a lot of transplant issues we have. People still have the choice. It's just their default tends to be go with whatever standard is. All right, so you can think about in work, when you've got an idea, present it as the default option unless they want to stop you from doing that. Say, hey, I was going to take this proposal across the street over to Lockheed, unless you don't want me to do that. Right? So now the default is, yeah, go ahead. Rather than arguing against it and causing yourself more energy. Bless you. All right, so we're going to skip this critical thinking, but do think about it at home. You know, if these are all irrational, why do we have heuristics and biases? Would they ever serve a purpose? Are they a beneficial byproduct of evolution, or something we evolved that has no benefit? Think critically about that one. I think it's an interesting topic of conversation. And so there's certain design principles we can incorporate in designing a system to help improve operator decision making. So one approach would be just redesign the task, right? Try to avoid working on improving the human. This would include creating systems with greater stability, leaving a much greater margin for error in the decisions. So how we structure those interactions are going to affect how people make their choices. Limit the number of options, right? Don't give them 30 options to choose from. Select useful defaults. Don't make the default something that is really kind of a suboptimal choice. You also want to make those choices concrete and make the consequences of those choices more obvious. We tend to have an optimism bias, right? It's why when we buy a lottery ticket, we think there's a chance we're going to be the one to win the $500 million jackpot. Make those consequences obvious, right? That's why they started putting those very kind of graphic labels on cigarettes. People tend to have an optimism bias of, it won't happen to me. I say, this can cause lung cancer. They're trying to combat that optimism bias. Also, where possible, create these kind of linear, comparable relationships. So one of the things you'll see at a lot of grocery stores is a price per ounce. Right? So this allows you to make kind of that optimal decision. Say, okay, product A is 34 cents per ounce. Option B is 31 cents per ounce. So option B is a better deal, even though it costs more because there are more ounces in that actual box. Sequence and partition those choices. So like I said, people are biased towards that equal distribution within a category. And so if I, as a financial planner, am presenting you with options, I probably don't want to present you the most risky option, right? Because you're going to see that as equally stable as everything else. So where possible, procedures and checklists are going to help make those decisions concrete, consistent, accurate. So again, the aviation industry has used this to great success. You know, the writer of your book, Chris Wickens, I worked with when I was at Colorado State. And before I got to Colorado State, He was a big climber, and he had an accident where he forgot to clip into the auto belay system, climbed up to the top of the wall, and then fell off. Or he actually jumped off, but that's because he thought he was going to be belayed, and fractured a whole bunch of bones. Really bad situation. But now, if you talk to those who climb with him, he has a very rigid procedure. He goes through and either has mnemonic devices or things that assist him with the actual checking procedure, checking process. Make sure that he is not making a decision to climb before, in fact, he is ready. So there are also cases wherein you can include computers to either establish decision trees or to do multi-attribute utility analyses to help with decisions. So thinking about training as well, you don't want to just rely on training for bad design. But when we're designing a training regimen, we want to make sure we're providing feedback. And that feedback obviously needs to be accurate, but it also needs to be timely. This can't be feedback 6 months down the road. It has to be action feedback, action feedback. We can also work on kind of de-biasing in training. So one of the things that some researchers have tried to do is overcome this confirmation bias, right? We have a certain cognitive bias. What are the things that we can do to try to help train that out? Or even if not train it out, use it against itself, right? So one of the things they will do in intelligence circles is what's known as red teaming, right? They'll have one team say, all right, you're going to advocate, let's just take the raid on bin Laden's compound. You're going to advocate for this being bin Laden, find all the evidence. The other team, you're going to advocate for this not being bin Laden, find all the evidence. And now you're just pitting confirmation bias against confirmation bias, right? To try to present as much of that competing evidence as is possible. How are we doing on time? Man, I get long-winded. All right, so situation awareness. Situation awareness is multifaceted, but it's first the perception of elements in an environment within a volume of time and space. So perceiving what's going on around you. Second level of situation awareness is the comprehension of their meaning. And then the final level of SA is being able to project into the future. So not only understanding, being able to perceive what's going on to make sense of it, but also say, okay, what does this mean one step down the road? Think again, back to driving. Driving along the road, you see somebody up in front of you swerving back and forth in the lanes. You're able to project forward that, hey, this poses a real risk. So you may slow down and pull back from that situation. This loss of situation awareness is what makes things like automating different tasks so dangerous. Right? There's a real propensity to say, let's just automate it. But when you automate something, the human tends to remove themselves from that loop. Right? I'm sitting in a self-driving car. I'm not paying attention to what's going on. It's self-driving. What the heck's the point of paying the extra $10,000 to get the self-driving features in a Tesla if I'm then going to be paying the same amount of attention? Right? But that's the dangerous thing. They no longer have that situation awareness. So now when the Tesla says, as it does, I can't do this, take over control immediately, there's no slow transition period. You're expecting that driver to take back control from that vehicle with limited situation awareness, not knowing that there's a motorcycle in its blind spot, right? So how can we improve situation awareness in our designs? First and foremost, create displays that really highlight the changes. So that's why you have those blind spot detection things on vehicles. I'm going to make it easy for you to know that there is now a change in your environment such that somebody is sitting in your blind spot. Make that situation easy to understand, so present info about the state of the system relative to the goals of the operator. All right, so when you look at your GPS map, your car is always facing to the top of your phone, and the map rotates around you, right? Because your goal is to continue going the direction you're facing, right? You're never thinking about, okay, now I have to rotate myself in space. You're rotating space around you. Keep that operator in the loop, right? So present that information. Tesla needs to be continuing to present information to you about what's going on in your environment. And also help people project into the future what the state of the system will be. Right? So create a display that projects into the future what this system is going to try to do in any situation. So before that happens, I can say, that's not going to work. Let me take back control. Organize that information around goals so displays should cluster info according to the goals that the operator is trying to achieve. So put information regarding speed all together. If it's aviation, put information about altitude or pitch all together. And we'll talk about integrated displays when we go over that later this semester. Yeah, we'll quickly go over this. So you want to have that display broaden the attention, right? So recognize that situation awareness is most critical when you're dealing with unexpected events, right? So try not to limit people's attention to specific sources of information that makes them less adaptable to when something critical comes up. There are also interventions wherein we can help people train to develop the situation awareness. Right? So train having a broader scope of selective attention in order to be aware of the state of the world should the system fail. Right? When you have that operator supervising that self-driving car, makes sense of the world. Right? When you're thinking about training for SA, think about what like the Secret Service does. Right? Trying to pick up on all sorts of information should something happen. So they know exactly what to do every time. You know, I ride a motorcycle, and one of the things we were told when I went through the motorcycle licensing process was at all times you need to be thinking about where's your escape, right? You can't lapse because it cannot be a, let me think about what's happening. So you have to go through this plan of saying, all right, should this car merge into the other car, where am I going? All right, so training that sort of situation awareness. Skip that because I talk like my life depends on it. So there is kind of a problem with the field of study that pertains to situation awareness, and that it tends to be kind of circular logic, right? So how do you know that situation awareness was low or was lost in a situation? Well, because the operator performed poorly, right? So if the operator performs poorly here, that must mean that situation awareness was lost. Well, how can we dictate that situation awareness was lost? Well, it results in that operator performing poorly. Right? So this is actually somewhat of a contentious debate in the field right now of, okay, well, maybe we can agree that situation awareness is a real construct that we should study, but the current way of studying it is circular. It's self-defining, right? And so something critical to think about. This is not in any way to undermine the whole concept of situational awareness, because I still talk about it all the time and we still use it in the field. But it's critical to think about, is there any sort of objective outside way in which we can establish situational awareness without it being self-referential? Whew. And once again, I'm blowing through these things. All right. So quickly, just to talk about metacognition. There are critical factors for decision makers when it comes to making those decisions. Right, as we already talked about that quote-unquote Rumsfeld quadrangle, right, the known knowns, known unknowns, unknown knowns, and unknown unknowns. You have to know what you don't know, right? This is the whole foundation for learning, right? Know what you do not currently know to be able to move forward. As part of that, you have to know when to quote-unquote purchase additional information. And that purchase can be the devotion of time, of actual resources. But when do I say that we don't have enough information, we need to spend an extra week going and getting this information? So calibrate your confidence in what you know. Right? Both overconfidence and underconfidence are killers, right? Obviously, being overconfident in the information you know opens itself up to a lot of disasters. What did Mark Twain say? It's not what you don't know that hurts you. It's what you know for certain that isn't so, right? So don't be overconfident in the information, but also don't be underconfident. You still want to be able to react and act based off of that information you have. Choose a decision strategy adaptively. So you have to know when, okay, we need to sit down and actually talk about this process, right? When I can move it from that system 1 type of thinking to that system 2. And then also processing that feedback. All right, so Emily, have you proposed your master's yet? So for those of y'all who haven't gone through the master's process, really quickly, what does the proposal look like?
Like a PowerPoint, but you kind of could like write up the like your literature reviews
Mm-hmm.
and everything, and then put all your hypotheses and your procedures into a paper,
Mm-hmm.
and you give it to your committee, and then they read it, but then you do a PowerPoint or a presentation kind of encapsulating everything that you've done.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so the whole process of proposing is to say, here's what I'm going to do. And the committee frequently then comes back at you with the feedback with the hopes that not only are we going to make that project better, but we're changing your decision-making process to say, okay, how do I know when I have enough information about this construct or this theory? All right, so we're going to try to poke holes to see where your limits of understanding are in this domain.
That's kind of the point of having like different fields represented in your committee too.
Exactly, yes. Yes, so when you propose a master's or a dissertation, you not only have people in your field, but people related to your field, maybe a different domain of psychology in my case. And then you'll frequently get somebody who's completely out of it. Right? So I had somebody who's in the business school on my dissertation committee. You may have people for engineering, you may have a psychologist for psychology, you may have engineering or whatever else. And it's processing that feedback to help you start reframing what you know about what you know. Right? And so my whole philosophy in education is I don't really give a crap what you think or what you know. I care that we're teaching you how to think and how to know. Right? It's that regurgitation of that feedback, or excuse me, it's the non-regurgitation of that information based off of the feedback we're giving you of saying, let's learn how to make these associations. Let's learn how to put everything together. The bottom line for today's class is humans are incredibly fallible in decision making. And I think the best illustration of this was a study that found the time of day somebody went up in front of a parole board affected how likely it was that they were going to be paroled. If you do it right at the beginning of the day, it's not very likely, but it is substantially more likely that a parolee is in fact paroled. But as you get close to lunch, right before lunch, that probability drops down to about 0. Right? Because the decision maker, in this case, the judge, has this kind of decision fatigue. The default is, nope, just stay in prison. Right? But after lunch, it jumps way back up and then again diminishes throughout the day. Right? So this is a case where you wouldn't think there would be any sort of influence other than the facts of the case. But humans are inherently flawed decision makers. Even in the domains that are specific, requiring specific knowledge and input, there are flawed decisions. And that's why now you start seeing attempts to get machines involved in this process to remove any sort of the negative decision making. So if, God forbid, any of y'all ever go to prison and are up for parole, try to get a parole hearing first thing in the morning or right after lunch. The end. All right. Your exam is, whoops, we're not doing a review. Ignore this. We're not doing a review. Don't expect a review. So on Thursday is your exam. It will be open at 12 a.m. on Thursday, and it will close at 11:59 p.m. You'll have 80 minutes to take it. Once you start taking it, you can't stop and come back to it. If you start taking it at 11:30 at night, you'll have 29 minutes to take it. So if you have any questions, let me know. I'll stick around. Otherwise, good luck on the exam, and I will see you next week.
I have a question not related to today, but for our like consultation with Boeing, what kind of like record keeping are you wanting us to do to make sure that, you know, like for our final paper or whatever? Are you wanting us to keep like a track of our meetings and like our minutes and things like that to see like what we've accomplished, or?
I'm less interested necessarily in those kind of small steps and more of what are the deliverables to the company, with the expectation that the deliverables are a byproduct of good organization early on. I'm also setting up kind of semi-regular meetings with these, with Boeing and with PDX kind of offline to talk to them of just about how things are going. So that kind of goes into the process. But keeping more of that information is not necessarily a bad thing.
And are we writing up like individual papers, or is this like supposed to be something we still do as a group?
I think it's going to kind of depend on what the scope of the project you're doing looks like. If it's a single unified thing, it'll probably be a much larger kind of group paper. If it's kind of fractions of smaller things, that will kind of be more individualized. But as we move through kind of post first exam, I'm going to do a kind of checkup with the groups to make sure that those are all explicit and clear and whatnot. But
yeah, we're also trying to kind of get on the same page with like it's taken a couple of meetings with Boeing for them to kind of figure out how to express to us what they're looking for, being that we're not, like, we don't have the same level of information as they do.
yes. And are they have y'all signed an NDA?
No, not yet. They haven't said anything to us.
Okay.
That I know of. But today we were supposed to on some like interviewing stuff. But they haven't been able to solidify that yet. So I think we're postponing that to next Tuesday.
Okay.
But like